The 9/11 terrorist attacks killed thousands of people and permanently changed the lives of all Americans. But what if they never happened? Things would be a whole lot different if September 11th, 2001 had ended up being just another Tuesday. The aftermath of 9/11 saw the global escalation of American military activity, especially in the Middle East and South Asia. This expansion, which has resulted in military actions in at least 14 countries to date, was possible thanks to the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force. The legislation, also known as Public Law 10740, or the War Powers Resolution, allowed President George W. Bush to use all necessary and appropriate force against any country, organization, or individual who may have aided and abetted the 9/11 attacks. It passed with near unanimous bipartisan approval in the Senate and served as a declaration of war against Taliban-ruled Afghanistan for sheltering al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed.
The resolution has been criticized as a blank check for presidentially directed foreign military activity. In addition to allowing the pursuit of 9/11-connected individuals, it also allows the president to pursue anyone who might harbor individuals or organizations involved in terror activities against the United States in the future, even if no hostile activities have actually occurred yet. New York City is considered the world's financial capital, but post 9/11, that title more accurately goes to the New York metro area, due to the post-9/11 exodus of financial firms from lower Manhattan's Wall Street. The 9/11 attacks hit financial firms quite hard. After all, many had offices or even headquarters inside or near the World Trade Center. According to Fortune, 40% of all deaths were among finance employees. Cantor Fitzgerald lost nearly 700, while other impacted companies included American Express, Morgan Stanley, and the Bank of New York. After the attacks, many of these companies packed up and left for the surrounding suburbs. It wasn't worth putting all their assets in a single place where a 9/11-style attack could decimate them again. The NASDAQ exchange, meanwhile, ditched Lower Manhattan for Times Square. Although the transformation of the financial district to a more economically diversified residential neighborhood was already underway, 9/11 accelerated it considerably. After the attacks, New York City officials and developers quickly met to redevelop the area and prevent it from decaying as firms left. The result was a high-end residential shopping district, complete with luxury boutiques, apartment complexes, and eateries. So while pre-9/11 Wall Street usually went quiet after business hours, the destruction of the World Trade Center and financial exodus turned the area into one of the city's hottest commercial and nightlife spots. Following the terrorist attacks, Congress passed the Patriot Act with near unanimous congressional approval, buoyed by Gallup polling that found a steady increase in support for the law from 2002. Without 9/11, Congress almost certainly would not have risked alienating Americans with the massive expansion of federal surveillance. The legislation expanded the federal government's ability to surveil and track Americans in the name of fighting terrorism abroad. Agents were given the power to use warrantless wiretapping and collect internet search histories, credit card histories, bank account information, and even library records without the knowledge of the suspects. The Department of Justice argued that agencies could more easily identify and charge terror suspects with such records, which would provide proof or probable cause of criminal activity. Opponents accused the act of violating First Amendment speech protections and Fourth Amendment guarantees against warrantless searches. The DOJ, in a back and forth with the ACLU, said critics had nothing to fear because only terrorists were targeted. The ACLU argued that the law's language was so vague that it could be used to surveil and harass anyone who ran afoul of the U.S. government, even individuals reading or purchasing certain books. The ACLU's predictions came true when the FBI demanded patron records from a consortium of Connecticut libraries, although the case went mostly unnoticed in the public eye. Once Edward Snowden revealed the full extent of Patriot Act spying in 2013, support for the act fell considerably.
The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong.
While the glamorous days of jet setting and Pan Am were long gone before 9/11, flying was still tolerable. The response to the attacks, however, turned it into a nightmare with the gauntlet of modern airport security. Before 9/11, passengers could go to the gate without a boarding pass or ID, keep their shoes and coats on, and typically just pass through a metal detector. As Jeff Price, an aviation security expert at Metropolitan State University of Denver, noted to NPR, before 9/11, security was almost invisible, and it was really designed to be that way. That all changed when President George W. Bush signed the 2001 Aviation Security and Transportation Act. which created the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, and introduced new anti-terror measures on travelers. A battery of security procedures became routine. Travelers had to remove outerwear and shoes, consent to pat-downs and body scans, and deal with far longer security lines and wait times. It is unclear whether or not the agency is actually effective in preventing terror attacks. ABC News learned exclusively from the Department of Homeland Security in 2015 that TSA agents missed objects like fake explosives and weapons up to 95% of the time. Along with changes to airport security, the Bush administration and Congress introduced a battery of new rules for pilots and cabin crew. Because 9/11 was a hijacking in which terrorists broke into the cockpits and took control of the airplanes, these new measures were meant to turn commercial airline cockpits into mini fortresses, safe from unauthorized access. With the Aviation Transportation Security Act, airlines were required to reinforce cockpit doors so they could not be easily broken down. In most cases, this has meant bulletproof, steel-reinforced doors that only the pilot or co-pilot can open from the inside. The 2002 Arming Pilots Against Terrorism Act further bolstered onboard security by allowing pilots to carry guns in case the cockpit was stormed. Cockpits effectively became no-go zones, meaning that passengers, especially children, could no longer visit them in flight to see the pilots in action. While the cockpit restrictions seemed like common sense, they created the possibility of a nightmare scenario if a pilot was incapacitated, or worse, had malicious intent. Those concerns were validated in the 2015 Germanwings tragedy, wherein co-pilot Andreas Lubitz intentionally crashed his airliner, killing himself and all 149 people on board. The captain was unable to stop him because he could not break down the reinforced door Lubitz had locked from the inside. Even the emergency override systems in place allow the pilot inside the cockpit to lock the door, thus preventing the override system from working, which is also what happened in the case of the Germanwings flight.
What can destroy this door? Anything?
Virtually nothing. They are very indestructible.
Can I kick it?
You can kick it.
Yeah.
The 2004 election, which pitted Democrat John Kerry against Republican incumbent George W. Bush, was a referendum on Bush's response to the 9/11 attacks. Pre-election Gallup polling certainly supported this view, with 49% of Americans ranking terrorism and national security as their chief concerns. Without 9/11, the 2004 election would have looked very different. According to New York Magazine, a number of the era's most esteemed minds believed that Bush would have lost without the ability to present himself as the tough-on-terror president. Kerry agrees, as he's blamed 9/11 for his defeat. However, historian Doris Kearns Goodwin noted that without 9/11, Kerry might not have even been the nominee. Democrats picked him to leverage his war service and foreign policy credentials with voters in the aftermath of wars that resulted from 9/11, like Iraq. In the absence of the global war on terror, the data suggests 2004 would have pitted Bush in a rematch against Al Gore, or against another Democrat with a campaign centered around the economy and jobs. After 9/11, the FBI concluded that the hijackers had managed to fund the attacks using American bank accounts opened without social security numbers. Their cash transfers, withdrawals, and debit card transactions went unnoticed as well. In response to this revelation, businesses and financial institutions were hit with new regulations. The first set of restrictions came with the Patriot Act, which required businesses to monitor suspicious activities and report them to the federal government. Banks were even expected to flag and close suspicious accounts, sometimes without notification or explanation to account holders. In some instances, banks allegedly targeted customers due to their ethnic or religious background, even without suspicious activity or criminal history. Businesses were also forced to ramp up background checks. For smaller institutions, this meant extra time and employees to conduct the checks, translating into higher operating costs and business closures. According to data from the security company Verified First, only about half of employers bothered to run background checks on potential hires before 9/11. Thanks to employers being more careful with new hires after the attacks, that number is now 95%. According to the Immigration and Human Rights Law Review, there were a grand total of 12 people on Washington's dreaded no-fly list before 9/11. By 2011, it had exploded to 420,000 as the National Terrorist Screening Center database started allowing federal agencies to add individuals based on terror suspicions and not just convictions. Being on the list prohibits individuals from flying within U.S. airspace. This is fine for convicted terrorists, but causes life-altering problems for those who are unjustly listed. The Ninth Circuit Court has recognized freedom of movement by all legal means as part of the Constitution's guarantee of liberty, meaning that listees with no criminal history lose their rights without due process. The list came under scrutiny amid allegations that the FBI blacklisted American Muslims to coerce them into becoming informants, but it wasn't until The Intercept's 2014 investigation that the full picture went public. The criteria for listing people was kept secret for a reason. They were violating the American legal standard of innocent until proven guilty. People have been arbitrarily designated as terrorists without reason or evidence, sometimes even for social media posts made by others. In a cruel twist, the proof falls on listees to prove their innocence.
Your name came up on a no-fly list. I need you to come with us.
Oh, hell no.
American neoconservatives, including Iraq War architects Douglas Faith and Richard Pearl, had been pushing regime change in Iraq since at least 1996. Given the influence such men held with the Bush administration, invading Iraq would likely have been a key Bush priority, 9/11 notwithstanding. But 9/11 certainly made the war an easier sell. President George W. Bush's case for war alleged that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had links to al-Qaeda and was producing weapons of mass destruction. The 9/11 Commission report linked Iraq with 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta as a state sponsor of terror. The message was clear: Saddam made America less safe. According to Gallup polling through 1999, 74% of Americans supported military action against Iraq. By February 2001, though, another poll found this number had dropped to 52%. Immediately after 9/11, support for war spiked to 74% and remained in the high 50s and low 60s, suggesting that the Bush administration would have otherwise struggled to convince Americans that Operation Iraqi Freedom was worthwhile. In a tight election, going to war with only 52% support that would evaporate if the conflict went badly, was political suicide. The attacks allowed Bush to invade Iraq and depose Saddam without torpedoing his re-election chances in 2004.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
The FBI came under fire in 2023 for spying on traditionalist Catholics on the grounds of fighting potential terrorism and violent domestic extremism. Despite the outrage, the practice was not new. Muslims faced the same FBI spying and entrapment schemes in mosques after 9/11. Without 9/11, the spying would probably have been considered intolerable, but after the attacks, many people tolerated it because the targets were Muslims like the hijackers. Regardless, it set the precedent for spying on places of worship in the name of security. In one particularly egregious case, the FBI planted an informant in a California mosque in the mid-2000s. He collected congregants' personal information, recorded individuals who had not been charged or suspected of a crime, and passed intel to the Bureau. He also attempted to entrap a handful of congregants into terror plots, despite FBI assurances that the Bureau was building bridges between Muslims and law enforcement. Imam Yasur Fazaga sued the FBI on First Amendment grounds, arguing that the Bureau targeted his congregants for practicing their religion. The FBI motioned to dismiss, arguing that the lawsuit would reveal state secrets, and won in district court. Following an appeal and a Supreme Court ruling in the FBI's favor that opened the path to dismissal on the state secrets privilege, the case is in the Ninth Circuit Court almost 2 decades after the spying occurred.